Title: The New Guy. I'd been at the office long enough to know that the real horror stories didn't come from the dark, empty hallways or the creaking elevator, but from the people you sat next to every day. The coworkers who smiled a bit too widely, who held your gaze a little too long, who seemed to watch you from the corner of their eyes like they were studying prey. It had been like that with him, Tom, the new guy. I remember the day he started. He had this unnerving smile plastered across his face, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. He seemed polite enough, a little too eager maybe, but that was normal for a newcomer. At first, he was just friendly, too friendly, always appearing out of nowhere, hovering over my shoulder with that silent tread that made me jump more than once. He'd pop into conversations that didn't concern him and laugh a bit too loudly at jokes that weren't that funny. His eyes, though, always stayed cold. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something about him seemed off. One Friday, Tom approached me as I was packing up to leave. "Hey, Danny," he said, his grin stretching wider than usual. "Heading out for the weekend?" "Yeah," I replied, trying not to sound as annoyed as I felt. "Just gonna relax. You?" Tom's grin faltered, and for a brief second, something dark flickered in his eyes. Then it was gone, and he was back to his usual creepy self. "Oh, might do some hiking. Clear my head. I know a great spot if you're interested." I had no interest in going anywhere with Tom, but I didn't want to be rude. "Maybe some other time," I mumbled, already turning back to my desk. He just stood there for a moment, staring at me in silence. Then he muttered something under his breath and walked away. I couldn't quite catch what he'd said, but the way he said it sent a chill down my spine. Over the next few weeks, Tom's behavior grew stranger. I'd catch him watching me from across the room, his eyes unblinking. He started sending me odd emails, messages with no subject, blank bodies, or a single word like soon or watch. I tried to brush it off as some weird joke or initiation ritual, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I turned around, there he was, standing too close, smiling that unnerving smile. One day I found a sticky note on my computer screen. It was written in a messy scrawl, just one word: tonight. I looked around the office, but Tom was nowhere to be seen. I shoved the note into my pocket, deciding I'd had enough. I was going to report him to HR. I wasn't sure what Tom's deal was, but it was starting to feel less like a prank and more like something sinister. But when I reached the HR office, they looked at me like I was speaking another language. "Tom?" the HR manager, Carla, asked, frowning. "There's no one named Tom in this office, Danny. Are you feeling okay?" I blinked. "No, there's definitely a guy named Tom. He started a few weeks ago. Tall, dark hair, weird smile." Carla shook her head slowly, a concerned look spreading across her face. "No, Danny, there's been no new hire named Tom." She pulled up a list on her computer. "Look for yourself." I scanned the screen. Nothing. No Tom. No new hire at all in the past few months. I felt a bead of sweat trickle down my back. This wasn't possible. I'd seen him, spoken to him. How could he not be in the system? Carla noticed my pale face and suggested I take the rest of the day off. I agreed, deciding to get out of there as quickly as possible. I left the office, but Tom's face stayed in my mind. His grin, his cold, dead eyes. I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being followed. That night, I woke to a noise outside my apartment. I lived on the second floor, so it wasn't easy for anyone to be at my window. Heart racing, I got up and slowly made my way to the window. The streetlight outside cast long shadows across the sidewalk. And then I saw him. Tom was standing there in the middle of the street, staring up at my window. His face was twisted into that grin. But now there was something else, something wild, hungry. He didn't move. He just stood there, watching me. I backed away from the window, grabbed my phone and dialed 911. But before I could press call, the lights flickered and went out. The room plunged into darkness. The sound of footsteps echoed through the hallway outside my door. Slow, deliberate steps. I held my breath, listening, the phone clutched tight in my hand. The footsteps stopped right outside my door, and then there was a knock. Knock, knock, knock. "Danny," a voice called, muffled through the door. "It's Tom? Can I come in?" My heart felt like it might explode out of my chest. "Go away," I shouted, panic seeping into my voice. Silence. And then the door handle started to turn, slowly, inch by inch. I backed up against the wall, my hands shaking as I held up my phone like a weapon. Suddenly, the handle stopped. There was a faint scratching sound like nails dragging across the wood, and then nothing. I stood there, frozen, for what felt like hours. Finally, I crept toward the door, listening. Nothing. I glanced through the peephole, but all I saw was darkness. The power flickered back on, and I quickly dialed the police. They came within minutes, but when they searched the area, they found no one. No sign of Tom. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next day, I went back to work, determined to get to the bottom of this. I asked everyone about Tom, but no one seemed to remember him. No one but me. That afternoon, I received an email. It was from a blocked address, the subject line reading, "You were right." Inside, there was just a single photo, a group picture of the office, taken a few months back. There we all were, smiling, but in the back corner there was Tom, his grin wider than ever, his eyes locked right on me. And then I noticed it, his hand, resting on the shoulder of a woman next to him, a woman who had left the company months before I had ever met Tom, a woman who'd gone missing shortly after quitting her job. My blood ran cold. I looked up from the screen, half expecting to see Tom standing behind me, but he was gone, and in the corner of my desk, another sticky note, the same messy scrawl. "See you soon." And in that moment, I realized I wasn't being followed by a new coworker. I was being hunted by something else entirely.
Story number 2.
Title: The Last Call. The dim hum of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Sarah glanced at the clock on her monitor. It was just past 9 p.m. and the office was nearly empty. She had stayed late again to finish the monthly reports. The quiet was unsettling. The usual chatter and clattering of keyboards were absent, leaving only the sound of her own typing. Sarah sighed and rubbed her temples. Working in a small marketing firm had its perks, but the workload was intense. She didn't mind, though. She enjoyed the challenge. However, there was one thing about this place that she couldn't shake off: Mark. Mark was the kind of coworker who made everyone uncomfortable. He had been with the company for years, and no one knew much about him. He rarely spoke, and when he did, it was in a low, almost inaudible voice. He had this habit of staring, not just glancing, but holding his gaze on people for far too long, making them shift uneasily in their seats. His presence was unnerving, like a shadow that lingered too long after the sun had set. Sarah remembered the first time she had noticed Mark. It was her third week on the job, and she had been walking to the break room. As she passed by his cubicle, she felt his eyes on her. When she looked over, he was staring at her, unblinking, his expression blank. She had quickly looked away, but that moment stayed with her. Since then, she avoided him as much as possible, but it was hard not to notice the little things, like how he always seemed to be there when she was alone, how his cubicle was just a few rows away from hers, yet she never heard him come or go. He was just there. Tonight was no different. As Sarah worked, she could feel a chill crawling up her spine. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see Mark standing behind her, but the office was empty. She shook her head, chiding herself for being paranoid. A ping from her computer brought her back to the task at hand. It was a message from Mark. "Mark, are you still here?" Sarah's fingers hovered over the keyboard. Why was he messaging her? She hesitated before typing a response. "Yeah, just finishing up. You?" There was a long pause before his reply. "Yes, I need to show you something. It won't take long." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She didn't want to be alone with him, but curiosity got the better of her. "Okay. Where?" Mark. "Meeting room 3. The message sent a shiver down her spine. Meeting room 3 was at the far end of the office, away from the main workstations and near the emergency exit. It was hardly ever used, especially not this late. She stood up and grabbed her phone, clutching it tightly as she made her way through the dimly lit office. The silence was oppressive, each step echoing unnervingly. When she reached the door of meeting room 3, she paused, her hand on the doorknob. Something felt wrong, but she shook off the feeling and pushed the door open. The room was dark, except for the faint glow of a single laptop screen at the far end of the table. Mark was sitting there, his face illuminated by the eerie light. He didn't look up when she entered. "Mark?" she called softly, her voice trembling slightly. "Close the door," he said, his voice cold and flat. Sarah hesitated, but complied, the door clicking shut behind her. The room felt suddenly smaller, the air thicker. She walked slowly toward him, her heart pounding in her chest. "What do you need to show me?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Without a word, Mark turned the laptop screen toward her. On it was a video, the image grainy and dark. She squinted, trying to make out what it was, but then the video started playing and her blood ran cold. It was a recording of the office, but not just any part of the office, her cubicle. The footage was from earlier that day, showing her typing away at her desk, completely unaware that she was being watched. The camera angle was odd, almost as if it were from a hidden camera placed somewhere in her workspace. "What the hell, Mark?" she demanded, stepping back. "What is this?" He finally looked up at her, his eyes devoid of emotion. "I've been watching you," he said, his voice as cold as ice. Sarah felt a wave of nausea wash over her. "This is sick! You can't do this!" Mark stood up, towering over her. "You don't understand," he said, his voice eerily calm. "I needed to protect you." "Protect me? From what?" Sarah backed up, bumping into the table behind her. "From them," Mark whispered, his eyes darting around the room as if he was searching for something unseen. Sarah's fear turned to confusion. "What are you talking about?" "They're coming for you," Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've seen them. I know what they want." Before Sarah could respond, the lights in the room flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. The only light was the faint glow of the laptop, now showing static. Sarah's breathing quickened as she fumbled for her phone, but her hands were shaking too much to get a grip on it. "Mark, this isn't funny! Stop it!" she yelled, her voice echoing in the dark room. There was no response. Suddenly she felt a cold hand grasp her wrist, and she screamed, jerking away. The room was filled with a strange, low hum, like a distant chant, growing louder by the second. "Sarah," Mark's voice was right next to her, but she couldn't see him. "They're here." Panic overtook her as she stumbled toward the door, her hands clawing at the darkness, trying to find the handle. The humming grew louder, more intense, until it was deafening. Just as her fingers brushed against the door handle, the noise stopped. Silence. Complete and utter silence. Then the lights flickered back on. Sarah was alone in the room. The laptop was off, the chair where Mark had been sitting was empty. It was as if he had never been there at all. She gasped, her heart pounding as she wrenched the door open and fled down the hallway, not stopping until she burst through the main doors and into the cool night air. She fumbled for her keys, her hands shaking uncontrollably, and jumped into her car, locking the doors behind her. As she sped away from the office, she glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see Mark standing in the parking lot, watching her leave. But there was no one there. The next day, Sarah didn't go to work. She couldn't. The thought of seeing Mark again, of facing whatever had happened in that room, was too much to bear. When she finally gathered the courage to call her boss and explain that she wouldn't be coming in, she was met with confusion. "Mark? There's no one by that name who works here, Sarah," her boss said. "Are you sure you're feeling okay?" Sarah hung up, her mind spinning. She checked the company directory, searched her emails, but there was no trace of Mark, no record of him ever working at the company. It was as if he had never existed. But Sarah knew he had. She could still feel the cold touch of his hand on her wrist, still hear his voice whispering in the darkness, and as she sat in her apartment staring at the empty office building in the distance, her phone buzzed with a new message. "Unknown number. I'm still watching. They're still coming." Her hands trembled as she read the message, dread creeping into her heart. No one knew about Mark. No one knew what happened in that room. But someone, or something, did, and they weren't done with her yet. The end.
Story number 3.
Title: The Night Shift. Chapter 1: The New Guy. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly as Emily walked down the narrow hallway toward her office. The building was eerily quiet, as it always was during the night shift. She had taken this job at a small marketing firm 3 months ago, mainly for the pay bump, but the isolation was starting to wear on her. The only other person who worked these late hours was Greg, the IT guy. He was quiet, almost too quiet. Greg had been with the company for years, but no one seemed to know much about him. He rarely spoke, his face always hidden behind a thick beard and large glasses that seemed to cover most of his expression. Emily couldn't shake the uneasy feeling she got whenever she was around him. There was something off about Greg. He always appeared suddenly, as if he materialized out of thin air. She would be working at her desk, focused on her report, and then, suddenly, he'd be there, so standing in the doorway with a blank stare. Tonight was no different. Emily sat at her desk, typing away, when she heard the familiar creak of the floorboards just outside her office. She looked up, and there he was, standing in the doorway. "Hey, Greg," she said, forcing a smile. "Need any help with your computer?" he asked in his usual monotone voice. "No, I'm good, thanks," she replied, hoping he would take the hint and leave. But he didn't move. "Are you sure? I can optimize your system, clear out any viruses. It'll run faster," he insisted, stepping closer to her desk. Emily's fingers tightened around the mouse. "Really, I'm fine, but I'll let you know if I need anything." Greg lingered for a moment longer before turning and walking away. Emily let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Something about him made her skin crawl. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but there was an unsettling darkness about him. The discovery. A few nights later, Emily was working late again. The office was empty, save for her and Greg. She was engrossed in a project when her computer screen flickered. Before she could react, it went black. She stared at the screen, her heart sinking. Greg's words echoed in her mind. Did he do something to her computer? She tried to restart it, but nothing happened. Frustrated, she decided to go find him. He was probably in the server room, tinkering with something. The server room was located in the basement, a place Emily had only visited a handful of times. It was cold and damp, with a faint smell of mildew. She hesitated at the top of the stairs, but the thought of her deadline pushed her forward. As she descended into the basement, she noticed that the lights were dimmer than usual, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. The air grew colder with each step. When she reached the bottom, she saw the server room door slightly ajar. Taking a deep breath, she pushed it open. The room was dark except for the soft glow of the server lights. Greg was sitting at a computer, his back to her. "Greg?" she called softly. He didn't respond. She stepped closer, her shoes echoing in the empty space. As she approached, she noticed something on the screen that made her blood run cold. It was a live feed of the office, her office. "What the hell?" she whispered. Greg slowly turned around in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Why are you watching me?" Emily demanded, her voice trembling. Greg stood up, towering over her. "I'm not watching you. I'm protecting you." "Protecting me? From what?" "From them," he said cryptically, his eyes narrowing. Emily backed away, her mind racing. None of this made sense. Greg took a step toward her, and she bolted out of the room, sprinting up the stairs 2 at a time. The revelation. Emily locked herself in her office, her heart pounding in her chest. She grabbed her phone to call the police, but before she could dial, the power in the entire building went out, plunging her into darkness. Panic set in as she fumbled for her flashlight. The beam cut through the dark, illuminating the small space around her. She needed to get out of the building, but something inside her told her Greg was waiting for her. As she moved toward the door, she heard a faint noise, a whisper. It wasn't Greg's voice, though. It was something else, something that chilled her to the bone. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, until it seemed to be coming from all around her. She swung the flashlight wildly, but saw nothing. The whispering intensified, turning into a cacophony of voices, each one vying for her attention. Then suddenly, they stopped. The silence was deafening. Emily stood frozen, her breath shallow. She could feel something standing behind her. Slowly she turned around and her flashlight flickered over a figure. A woman, gaunt and pale, with hollow eyes and a twisted smile. The woman's face was inches from hers, yet she hadn't made a sound. Emily screamed and bolted for the door, but the woman was faster. She moved with inhuman speed, blocking Emily's path. The twisted smile grew wider, revealing rows of sharp teeth. Emily stumbled back, falling to the floor. The woman loomed over her, the sut reaching out with clawed hands. Just as the woman's fingers grazed her skin, the door to her office burst open, and Greg rushed in. He held up a small device, pressing a button. The woman let out an ear-piercing screech before vanishing into thin air. Emily sat on the floor, trembling, as Greg helped her to her feet. "They were after you," he said simply. "I've been keeping them at bay." Emily stared at him in disbelief. What was that?" "They're spirits," Greg explained, his voice calm. "They're drawn to fear, to loneliness. This building is full of them. I've been keeping an eye on you, making sure they don't get too close. Emily's mind reeled. It all sounded insane, yet she had just seen it with her own eyes. You're safe now, Greg added, his expression softening. But you should leave. Quit this job. They'll come back, and I won't always be here. Without another word, Greg turned and left the office. Emily stood there, shaken and unsure of.
Story number 4.
Unseen observer. When you work late at the office, you start noticing things. Little things. The way the lights flicker just slightly around midnight. The way the air seems to grow colder the later it gets. The way the building settles with odd creaks and groans like it's alive. I'd been working at Trask and Moore for almost 3 years, mostly pulling late nights to finish up reports when I first noticed it. Or rather, him. It started small. I'd be sitting at my desk, the only one left on the floor, and I'd hear it. A soft, almost imperceptible sound like someone breathing just behind me. I'd turn around quickly, but there was never anyone there. Just the rows of empty desks and the dim light from the hallway beyond. One night, as I was getting ready to leave, I saw a shadow move across the far wall. It was quick, like someone darting behind a cubicle. My heart skipped a beat. "Hello?" I called out, feeling silly as soon as I said it. Silence. I shook my head, laughed it off, and went home. But that wasn't the last time I'd see that shadow. Over the next few weeks, it became a regular occurrence. The flicker of movement just at the edge of my vision. The soft sound of footsteps in the distance, just barely audible over the hum of the air conditioning. I started to think I was losing my mind. Then, one night, I decided to stay even later than usual to catch up on a backlog of work. Midnight came and went, and the office grew silent. I was focused on my computer screen, trying to ignore the creeping sensation that I was being watched. And then I heard it. Whispering. Soft, barely there whispers, coming from somewhere behind me. I froze, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. I didn't turn around right away, afraid of what I might see. But the whispering continued, unintelligible, like a voice trying to speak from the bottom of a well. Slowly, I turned in my chair. Nothing, just the empty office, the shadows stretching long in the dim light. But then my eyes caught something, a figure standing at the end of the hallway. A tall, thin silhouette. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at it. It was too dark to see clearly, but I could make out the shape of a man, just standing there, watching me. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, its head tilted slightly, as if curious. I reached for my phone, my hand shaking. "I'm calling security," I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. The figure turned, slowly, and started to walk away, disappearing into the darkness of the hallway. I hesitated for a moment, then grabbed my things and bolted. I reported the incident to security the next day. They checked the cameras, but there was nothing there. Just me, sitting at my desk, talking to an empty hallway. After that, I started noticing more things. Papers on my desk would be rearranged when I returned from the bathroom. My computer screen would flicker, showing brief glimpses of emails I'd never sent or drafts of messages addressed to me with no sender. I could feel eyes on me, even when I knew I was alone. One day, a coworker, Linda, pulled me aside. "Have you seen anything strange lately?" she asked, her voice low. I hesitated, then nodded. "Why?" She looked around nervously, then whispered, "I think there's something wrong with this place. I've been hearing things too, seeing things. Like there's someone else here, but no one ever sees them directly." We both agreed it was best to let it go, to try not to think about it. But it kept happening. And then Linda didn't show up to work. Her desk sat empty for days. No one seemed to know where she'd gone. She wasn't answering her phone, and her email bounced back with an error message. I asked around, but everyone just shrugged it off. "People leave," they said. "It happens." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened to her. Something connected to the shadow in the hallway, the whispers, the strange emails. A few nights later, I was staying late again, trying to meet a deadline. The office was dead silent, save for the hum of the fluorescent lights above. I'd lost track of time, focused on my work, when suddenly the computer screen flickered and went dark. "What the?" I muttered, tapping the keys, but the screen stayed black. And then, slowly, words began to appear, typed out letter by letter. "I see you." My breath caught in my throat. I tried to turn off the monitor, but the power button didn't work. The words continued to appear, one slow letter at a time. You should have left. I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. The whispers started again, louder this time, and I realized they were coming from all around me. I turned, and there, standing in the hallway, was the figure, closer now. Much closer. I backed away, my heart racing, but the figure didn't move. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long limbs that seemed to stretch and bend in unnatural ways, and its face was completely blank. Just smooth, empty skin where eyes, a nose, a mouth should be. I grabbed my bag and ran, not looking back. I reached the elevator, my fingers slamming the button repeatedly. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening now, and I could feel something brushing against the back of my neck, like cold breath. The elevator doors finally opened and I stumbled inside, jamming the close door button. As the doors began to slide shut, I saw it again, standing right outside, its hand reaching out, fingers impossibly long and thin. The doors closed, and I felt the elevator lurch downward. I didn't breathe until I was out on the street, the cool night air filling my lungs. I never went back to that office. I quit the next day. Weeks passed, and I tried to put it behind me, tried to forget. But then, one morning, I received an email. No subject, no body text, just an attachment. I opened it without thinking, and my blood ran cold. It was a photo, taken from behind me. There I was, sitting at my desk, staring at my computer screen.
Story number 5.
Title: The Whispering Wall. Nestled at the edge of town, obscured by overgrown trees and shrouded in the shadow of a decaying warehouse, stood a dilapidated office building. Once the headquarters of a thriving logistics company, the building had long been abandoned, its windows boarded up and its walls covered in layers of graffiti. Yet, despite its state, a small IT startup had recently moved into the building, lured by the cheap rent and spacious layout. Kate had been with the company for just over a month. Fresh out of college and eager to prove herself, she often stayed late, finishing up tasks and organizing the chaotic mess left behind by the previous tenants. She didn't mind the quiet. In fact, she preferred it. There was something calming about the stillness after everyone else had gone home. But tonight, the quiet felt different. It felt heavy, as if the silence was pressing down on her, suffocating. The air was thick with dust, and every creak of the floorboards echoed ominously through the empty halls. Kate rubbed her arms, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over her. It was just an old building, she told herself. Old buildings made noises. That was all. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She glanced at the clock on her monitor, 10:30 p.m. The office was completely empty, save for her and the flickering light of her computer screen. She saved her work and shut down her computer, deciding it was time to call it a night. As she packed up her things, a faint noise caught her attention. It was so quiet at first that she thought she had imagined it, but then she heard it again, a low, whispering sound coming from somewhere down the hall. Kate froze, her heart racing. She listened intently, but the sound was so soft that she couldn't make out what was being said. It was as if someone was whispering just on the edge of her hearing, their words lost in the darkness. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling slightly. No response. She hesitated, then grabbed her phone and switched on the flashlight. The narrow beam of light cut through the darkness, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Slowly, she made her way down the hall, following the sound. The whispers grew louder as she approached the far end of the building, where an old server room was located. The door to the room was slightly ajar, and the whispers seemed to be coming from inside. Kate pushed the door open, her flashlight illuminating rows of dusty servers, long since out of use. The room was cold, the air stale and heavy. The whispers were clearer now, though still incomprehensible, like a voice speaking in a language she couldn't understand. She stepped further into the room, her breath fogging in the frigid air. The source of the whispers seemed to be coming from one of the walls at the back of the room, where the paint had peeled away to reveal the bare concrete beneath. There was something unsettling about the wall, something that made Kate's skin crawl. She approached it slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if urging her to come closer. She reached out, her hand trembling, and touched the cold, rough surface of the wall. As soon as her fingers made contact, the whispers stopped. The sudden silence was deafening, pressing in on her from all sides. Kate's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the wall, her hands still resting against it. Then, without warning, the wall shifted. Kate gasped and pulled her hand back, stumbling away from the wall. She watched in horror as the concrete seemed to ripple, the surface bulging outward, as if something was pushing from the other side. The whispers started again, louder this time, frantic and desperate. The wall bulged further, cracks forming along the surface as whatever was behind it struggled to break free. Kate turned and ran, her footsteps echoing loudly in the empty halls. She didn't stop until she reached the exit, bursting through the doors and into the cool night air. She doubled over, gasping for breath, her mind racing. She couldn't go back in there, not after what she had just seen. The next morning, Kate arrived at the office early, determined to find an explanation for what had happened. But when she entered the building, everything seemed normal. The halls were empty, the lights flickered on as usual, and the server room door was closed. She hesitated outside the door, her hand hovering over the handle. She didn't want to go in, but she had to know. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was exactly as she had left it, except for one thing, the wall. The concrete was smooth, unblemished, as if nothing had ever happened. But Kate knew what she had seen. She wasn't imagining it. She searched the room, looking for any sign of what had caused the whispers, but there was nothing. No cracks, no bulges, nothing out of place. It was as if the wall had healed itself overnight. As she stood there, staring at the wall, the whispers started again. But this time they were different, clearer. They weren't just random sounds, they were words. And they were calling her name. Kate stumbled back, her heart racing. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they were almost shouting. Her name echoed through the room, over and over, coming from every direction. She clamped her hands over her ears, trying to block out the sound, but it was no use. The whispers were inside her head, burrowing deep into her mind. Then, as suddenly as they had started, they stopped. Kate opened her eyes, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The room was silent once more, the wall standing silent and foreboding. But something had changed. She could feel it. A cold, creeping dread settled over her as she realized the truth. The wall wasn't just a wall. It was a door to something terrible, something that had been trapped for years, waiting for someone to set it free. And now, it was awake. Kate backed out of the room, her hands trembling. She had to leave. She had to get out of this building, away from whatever was behind that wall. But as she turned to flee, the door slammed shut, trapping her inside. The whispers started again, louder and more frantic than before, echoing through the room, through her mind. And this time, there was no escape. The wall shifted once more, the concrete cracking and crumbling as whatever was behind it pushed its way through. Kate's scream was lost in the cacophony of voices as the wall shattered, releasing a torrent of darkness that swallowed her whole. The next day, the office was quiet. The employees went about their work as usual, unaware of what had happened the night before. Kate's desk was empty, her computer off, her chair pushed neatly under the desk. No one noticed the small, dark stain on the floor near the server room or the faint whispering that echoed through the halls late at night. And no one noticed
Story number 6.
The night shift. Mara never liked working the night shift at the office. The tall glass building, bustling with activity during the day, felt eerie and desolate after hours. The cubicles, once buzzing with chatter, now stood as dark silhouettes against the dim glow of emergency lights. The only sound was the low hum of the air conditioning, punctuated by the occasional creak of settling metal. Mara had been at Texas for 6 months. She'd been hired as a data analyst, a job that required little human interaction, a perfect fit for her introverted personality. But the real reason she took the job was to get away from her previous workplace, where she'd had a series of unsettling encounters with a coworker named Lyle. Lyle was quiet and unassuming, with a gaunt face and deep-set eyes that never seemed to blink. At first, Mara dismissed his odd behavior as simple awkwardness, but as time went on, she began to notice him everywhere. In the break room, in the hallway, even outside her apartment building. He never said anything, just stared, his gaze intense and unnerving. She'd reported him to HR, but nothing came of it. Eventually, she couldn't take it anymore and left the job, hoping to leave Lyle behind. But on her first day at Texas, she spotted him. He was standing at the end of the hallway, staring at her with those same unblinking eyes. She froze, heart pounding, but when she blinked, he was gone. She convinced herself it was just her imagination, a residual fear from her last job. After all, what were the chances that he would end up at the same company? The night shift had been quiet until now. Mara was reviewing some data logs when the lights flickered. She paused, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. A low, almost imperceptible thud echoed from somewhere in the building. She strained her ears, but the sound didn't repeat. Shaking off her unease, she resumed her work. Another hour passed, and the incident slipped to the back of her mind. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw a shadow move across the far end of the office. She quickly turned her head, but there was nothing there, just rows of empty cubicles. Her pulse quickened. "Just tired," she muttered to herself. "That's all." She forced herself to focus on the screen, but the uneasy feeling wouldn't leave. It felt as if someone was watching her. She tried to shake it off, but the sensation grew stronger with each passing minute. Suddenly her computer screen flickered, displaying a distorted image before going black. The office was plunged into darkness, save for the faint glow of the emergency lights. Her breath caught in her throat as she frantically pressed the power button, but the screen remained dead. A noise broke the silence, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and growing closer. Mara's heart raced as she stood up, peering into the darkness. The footsteps stopped, and for a brief moment there was only silence. Then a voice, low, raspy, and far too close. "Hello, Mara." She spun around, her eyes wide with fear. Standing a few feet away, partially hidden in the shadows, was Lyle. His face was pale, almost ghostly, and his eyes, those cold, unblinking eyes, were locked onto hers. "Lyle?" Her voice trembled. "What are you doing here?" He took a step forward, his expression unreadable. "I missed you, Mara. You left without saying goodbye." She backed away, her mind racing. This couldn't be real. He couldn't be here. But the fear was all too real, coursing through her veins like ice. "Why are you here?" she demanded, trying to keep her voice steady. Lyle tilted his head, a twisted smile creeping across his face. "You didn't think you could escape me, did you?" Panic surged through her. She turned and bolted towards the exit, her footsteps echoing in the empty office. She reached the door and yanked it open, but as she stepped into the hallway, she froze. The hallway was wrong, impossibly long and stretching into darkness with no end in sight. Behind her, she heard Lyle's slow footsteps approaching. Desperate, she sprinted down the hall, but no matter how fast she ran, the door at the end remained out of reach, the darkness seeming to swallow her whole. She glanced over her shoulder and saw Lyle closer than before, his steps unhurried, as if he knew she couldn't escape. Panic threatened to consume her as she pushed herself to run faster, but her legs felt heavy, as if the air itself was thickening around her. Finally, she reached the end of the hallway, slamming into the door. She grabbed the handle, her hands trembling, and pushed. The door swung open, and she stumbled through, only to find herself back in the office, the same office she had just fled from. Her mind reeled. This was impossible. She was trapped in some sort of nightmare, a twisted loop with no way out. The lights flickered again, and she heard Lyle's voice, calm and mocking. "There's no escape, Mara. You belong here." She spun around, searching for another way out, but the office seemed to warp and distort around her. Desks twisted into grotesque shapes, and the walls pulsed like they were alive. Lyle stepped closer, his presence suffocating. "No," she whispered, backing away. "This isn't real." "Oh, it's very real," Lyle whispered back, his voice dripping with malice. "And it's only the beginning." He reached out, his hand brushing against her arm, and a wave of cold washed over her. Her vision blurred, and the world tilted. She stumbled, falling to the floor, her strength draining away as darkness closed in. When Mara woke, she was back at her desk.
Story number 7.
Title: The Third Stall. The office bathroom had always given me the creeps. Maybe it was the flickering fluorescent lights or the way the door creaked loudly whenever it opened. But there was something else, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The kind of feeling that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up. It was always the third stall. No matter how many times I used the bathroom, that stall seemed wrong. The door was always slightly ajar, just enough to see the faint outline of the toilet inside. It was never fully closed, never fully open, and somehow I always felt like someone was watching me through that thin sliver of space. But I had brushed it off as paranoia, or the result of too many late nights working overtime. Everyone in the office knew I was the guy who stayed the latest, burning the midnight oil long after everyone else had gone home. I didn't mind it. The quiet helped me focus. One night, I was there even later than usual. It must have been close to 1 a.m. The building was completely silent. The only sound, the distant hum of the central air system. I had downed 3 cups of coffee to keep myself awake and felt the urgent need to use the bathroom. I got up and made my way to the restroom at the end of the hall, yawning as I pushed the heavy door open. The bathroom was cold, colder than usual. I flicked on the lights, and they buzzed to life, dim and flickering. I tried not to look at the third stall. I told myself it was just a normal bathroom, and that I was being ridiculous. I chose the first stall, but as soon as I closed the door behind me, I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible rustling coming from the third stall. It sounded like fabric brushing against something, or maybe the faint scrape of shoes on the floor. I froze, holding my breath, listening. The sound stopped. I exhaled slowly, convinced it was just my imagination. But then it started again, louder this time. A soft tapping noise, like fingers drumming on the wall. I swallowed hard, my heart beginning to race. "Hello?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Is someone there?" No response, just silence, and then the faint rustle again, like someone shifting their weight inside the third stall. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. I leaned down, peeking under the stalls. I could see the shoes in the third stall. They were pointed directly toward me, but there was something odd about them. They were old-fashioned, like something out of the 1950s, scuffed leather with thick laces. I quickly stood back up, my heart now pounding in my chest. I hadn't heard anyone come in. No footsteps, no door creak. I was sure I was alone when I came in. I hesitated, then slowly stepped out of my stall, deciding I was just being stupid. The shoes didn't move. I could feel my pulse in my ears. Then the door of the third stall creaked open a little wider. I stared at the sliver of darkness inside, waiting for something, anything to come out, but it remained still. I don't know why I did it, but I stepped closer. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe just some irrational need to confront whatever was happening. The rustling grew louder, more frantic, and the door began to shake slightly, as if something were pushing against it from the inside. My hand reached out almost of its own accord. I was inches away from the stall door when it suddenly slammed shut with a deafening bang. I jumped back, a scream caught in my throat, and then I heard it. A low, guttural whisper coming from inside the stall, a voice that sounded like it was being dragged through gravel. "Why are you here?" I stumbled back, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. The lights above flickered, and in that brief flash of darkness, I saw it, something in the gap between the door and the wall. A face, pale and drawn, with hollow, dark eyes that seemed to bore right through me. I bolted for the door, throwing it open and nearly crashing into the hallway wall. I didn't stop running until I was back at my desk, gasping for breath. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely dial my coworker, Lisa, who worked late sometimes too. "Lisa," I panted when she answered. "You have to come up here, please." Within 10 minutes, Lisa was at my desk, concern etched on her face. "What happened?" she asked. I tried to explain, but it sounded crazy even to my own ears. There's someone in the third stall of the men's bathroom," I finally managed. Lisa's face paled. "Danny," she whispered. "Are you serious?" I nodded, still feeling the cold sweat on my neck. "You have to see it for yourself." Reluctantly, we made our way back to the bathroom. I pushed the door open, and Lisa stepped inside, her hand gripping mine tightly. The lights flickered again, but the room was empty. The third stall door stood slightly ajar, just as it always did. I pointed to it. "Look," I whispered. "That's where." But before I could finish, Lisa let out a scream. I turned to see what she was looking at, and my blood ran cold. In the reflection of the bathroom mirror, we saw the stall door slowly swinging open. There was nothing inside. But as we watched, a shadow began to form in the mirror's reflection. A dark, indistinct figure standing in the third stall facing us. Its head tilted at an unnatural angle, and then it moved. It stepped forward, but only in the reflection. In the mirror, it seemed to be coming straight toward us, but when I glanced back at the stall, it was still empty. Lisa grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "Let's get out of here," she shouted, yanking me toward the door. We ran, slamming the bathroom door behind us. We didn't stop until we were out of the building, gasping for air in the cold night. I turned to look up at the office windows, half expecting to see something staring back. The next day, I told my manager I couldn't work late anymore. I didn't care about deadlines or projects. I wasn't going to be in that building after dark. Lisa refused to use the bathroom at all, opting instead for the public restroom down the street. A few days later, I learned something that sent a shiver down my spine. An old janitor, Ted, who had worked in the building for years, pulled me aside. "You know about the third stall, don't you?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded slowly, afraid of what he might say. He leaned closer, his eyes dark and serious. "Years ago, back in the 50s, there was a man who worked here. He'd stay late, just like you. One night, he went into that bathroom and, well, he never came out. They found his shoes, though. Old leather ones, just inside the third stall. Some folks say he's still in there, waiting, watching." I felt the blood drain from my face. I didn't know what to say, what to believe. Ted just gave me a grim smile. "If I were you," he whispered, "I'd stay clear of that stall. Some things are better left alone." I never worked late again, and I never ever went near the third stall. But sometimes, just sometimes when the office is quiet, I hear it. The soft rustling sound, the faint tap of old shoes against tile, and I wonder if he's still there, waiting for someone else to make the...
Story number 8.
Melanie had always been a night owl, so when she landed a job as a night shift security guard at a corporate office building downtown, she figured it was a perfect fit. The building was a sleek, modern tower with glass walls that reflected the city lights. During the day, it buzzed with activity, but at night, it was a different world. Silent, still, and empty. Her job was simple: monitor the security cameras, patrol the floors, and make sure everything was in order. Most nights were uneventful. The occasional false alarm from a motion sensor or a cleaning crew leaving a door unlocked, but nothing major. Melanie enjoyed the solitude, the quiet hours that allowed her to think, to daydream. But something about the building felt off. It was subtle at first. Small things she could easily brush off. The elevator doors opening by themselves on empty floors, lights flickering for no reason, shadows that seemed to move when she wasn't looking directly at them. She chalked it up to her imagination, the result of long hours alone in a deserted building. Then there was the 13th floor. Officially, the building didn't have a 13th floor. The elevator went from the 12th floor straight to the 14th, a common practice in older buildings. But Melanie had always found it strange, almost superstitious. One night, out of curiosity, she decided to check it out. She stood in the elevator, her finger hovering over the buttons. She knew the elevator was supposed to skip from 12 to 14, but she pressed 12 first, then 14. Nothing unusual. But as she was about to press the button for the lobby, she hesitated. Then she moved her finger to the space between the 12 and 14 buttons and pressed. To her surprise, the elevator started moving. Her heart pounded as the numbers on the display flashed: 12, 13, 14. The elevator came to a stop with a soft ding. The doors slid open, revealing a dark, narrow hallway that shouldn't have existed. Melanie stood frozen, staring into the darkness. The hallway was dimly lit by a single flickering light bulb hanging from the ceiling. The walls were bare, painted a dull gray, and the air was thick with the smell of mildew and something else she couldn't quite place. She knew she should close the doors and go back to the lobby, but curiosity got the better of her. She stepped out of the elevator, her footsteps echoing eerily in the narrow space. The doors closed behind her with a soft hiss, leaving her alone on the 13th floor. The hallway stretched out in front of her, lined with doors on either side. The doors were old, wooden, and slightly warped, as if they had been there for decades. There were no signs, no numbers, just door after door leading to who knew where. Melanie walked slowly down the hallway, her breath coming in shallow, nervous gasps. Something about this floor felt wrong, as if it didn't belong in the building at all. The air was cold, and she could hear a faint buzzing, like distant static, growing louder with each step. She reached the end of the hallway and found herself standing in front of a single door, slightly ajar. The buzzing was louder now, almost unbearable, like a swarm of insects trapped just beyond the door. She reached out, her hand trembling, and pushed the door open. The room beyond was pitch black, the buzzing so loud now that she had to cover her ears. She stepped into the darkness, the door creaking shut behind her, sealing her inside. The buzzing abruptly stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. Melanie fumbled for her flashlight, her fingers shaking as she switched it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing an old, decrepit office. The walls were lined with filing cabinets, their drawers hanging open, papers spilling out onto the floor. Dust covered every surface, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. In the center of the room was a desk, and behind it, a figure. Melanie froze, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The figure was slumped over the desk, its back to her. It was a man, dressed in an old-fashioned suit, his hair gray and unkempt. He didn't move, didn't acknowledge her presence. "Hello?" Melanie's voice came out as a whisper, barely audible in the oppressive silence. The figure didn't respond. She took a step closer, her heart pounding in her chest. The room felt wrong, like a place that had been forgotten by time, left to rot in the darkness. She stepped around the desk, her flashlight shining on the man's face. What she saw made her scream. The man's face was twisted in a grotesque mask of pain, his eyes wide and staring, his mouth open in a silent scream. His skin was pale and waxy, as if he had been dead for years. But what horrified Melanie the most was the black, oozing substance that seeped from his eyes, ears, and mouth, staining his suit and pooling on the desk in front of him. She stumbled back, her flashlight slipping from her hand and clattering to the floor. The room plunged into darkness, but she didn't need the light to know the man was still there, still watching her with those dead, empty eyes. She turned and ran, her hands outstretched, fumbling for the door. She found it, yanking it open and racing down the hallway, her footsteps echoing like gunshots in the stillness. The elevator was waiting, the doors open, and she threw herself inside, jabbing the button for the lobby. The doors slid shut, and the elevator began its descent. Melanie collapsed against the wall, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her heart pounding in her ears. She didn't know what she had just seen, and she didn't want to know. All she knew was that she had to get out of this building, had to get away from whatever was on the 13th floor. When the elevator reached the lobby, she bolted out, not even bothering to look back. She burst through the front doors and into the cool night air, gasping for breath as she collapsed on the sidewalk. She never went back to that building. She quit her job the next day, not even bothering to explain why. But the memory of that night haunted her. The image of the man's twisted face burned into her mind. A few weeks later, she heard a rumor about the building. Apparently, it had been built on the site of an old office complex that had burned down in the 1950s. Several people had died in the fire, their bodies never recovered. The building had been abandoned for years before being renovated into the modern office tower it was now. But Melanie knew the truth. The 13th floor wasn't supposed to exist. It was a remnant of the old building, a place where the dead still lingered, trapped in the darkness, waiting for someone to set them free.
Story number 9.
Title: The Temp. It was a sweltering Tuesday afternoon when the temp arrived. I remember because the air conditioning had been broken for 2 days and the office felt like a sauna. Everyone was on edge, sweat beading on their foreheads, tempers flaring over the smallest things. I saw her standing by the reception desk, holding a plain brown folder and wearing a polite, patient smile. She was ordinary looking, with dark hair pulled back into a tight bun and large glasses that magnified her pale blue eyes. The kind of person you wouldn't notice in a crowd. The receptionist waved me over. "This is Sarah," she said. "She's the new temp. Could you show her around?" I forced a smile. I didn't have time to babysit a temp. I had deadlines looming and my shirt was sticking to my back. But I nodded and motioned for Sarah to follow me. She walked behind me in silence as I showed her the layout, the break room, the printer, the emergency exits. I tried to keep it short, but every time I glanced back at her, she was watching me intently, her gaze sharp and unblinking. "Have you done temp work before?" I asked, trying to make small talk. She smiled, a thin, almost apologetic smile. Oh, yes, I've been to many offices like this one. They're all quite similar. I nodded, a little creeped out by the way she said that, like she wasn't quite sure if she was telling the truth. Well, if you need anything, just ask. Your desk is over there by the window. She thanked me and took her seat, and I was relieved to get back to my own work. But as the day went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Every time I glanced over at Sarah, she was sitting unnaturally still, her hands folded neatly on the desk, her eyes moving around the room like she was studying everyone. She never blinked. Not once. It was unsettling, like watching a mannequin try to mimic human behavior. Later that afternoon, I overheard a conversation between two of my coworkers, Mark and Janice. They were whispering in hushed tones, their eyes darting over to where Sarah sat. "Do you think she knows?" Janice asked, her voice tight with concern. Mark shook his head. "How could she? But it's just strange, isn't it? She looks just like her." "Who?" I interrupted, curiosity getting the better of me. "Who does she look like?" They both turned to me, startled. Mark leaned in closer. "You don't remember? The temp from a few years ago? What was her name? Melissa? The one who disappeared." I frowned. "I wasn't here back then." "What do you mean, disappeared?" Mark hesitated, glancing at Janice. She sighed and leaned in closer, whispering, "There was a temp, Melissa. She was only here for a few weeks, and then one day she just vanished. No one knew where she went. Her desk was cleared out, and the agency said they never heard from her again. Some say she was taken." "Taken?" I scoffed. "By who?" They exchanged another uneasy glance. "No one knows," Janice said. "But Sarah, she looks exactly like her. Same hair, same glasses. It's like they're twins or something." I looked over at Sarah again. She was still staring straight ahead, as if she knew we were talking about her. A chill ran down my spine. I laughed it off, but the unease lingered. The next few days only got stranger. Sarah seemed to be everywhere. I'd see her in the break room, but when I went to make a coffee, she'd already be back at her desk, even though I never saw her walk past me. Sometimes I'd hear her voice whispering something under her breath, but when I'd turn to look, she'd be sitting in complete silence, her lips not moving. I tried to shrug it off as new person awkwardness, but then small things started happening. Items on my desk would move when I wasn't looking, a pen would roll to the edge, my stapler would be in a different spot, my chair would be slightly out of place. At first I thought I was imagining it, but it kept happening more frequently, and always when Sarah was nearby. One afternoon, I found a note on my desk. It was written in a spidery, almost childish script. 3 words, "She knows everything." I felt my stomach drop. I glanced around, but no one seemed to be paying attention. Sarah was at her desk, staring straight ahead, unblinking as usual. I crumpled the note and tossed it into the trash, trying to ignore the creeping sensation crawling up my spine. That night, I stayed late to finish a project. The office was empty, except for Sarah. She sat at her desk, staring out the window into the dark, her face partially obscured by shadows. I felt an irrational anger bubble up. Why was she still here? Didn't she have somewhere else to be? I stood up, determined to confront her, but the lights flickered, and for a split second I could have sworn I saw someone else standing behind her, another figure, taller, with long, dark hair. But then the lights steadied, and it was just Sarah again, staring blankly at her computer screen. I shook my head, chalking it up to exhaustion. "Sarah?" I called out, trying to keep my voice calm. She turned to look at me, her head tilting to the side like a curious bird. "Yes?" "Why are you still here?" I asked, my voice a little too loud in the quiet room. "It's late. Shouldn't you go home?" She smiled, that same thin, polite smile. "I'm waiting." "For what?" Her eyes seemed to darken, just a bit. "For you to leave." I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. I forced a laugh. "Well, I'm almost done. You don't have to wait for me." She didn't reply, just turned back to her screen, her fingers tapping slowly, rhythmically on the desk. I finished my work as quickly as I could, grabbed my things, and headed for the door. But just as I reached the elevator, I heard her voice, soft and clear. She didn't leave, you know. I turned back, my heart racing. "Who?" "The other temp," she said, her smile never faltering. "Melissa. She stayed. She's still here." The elevator doors opened with a ding, and I stepped inside, jabbing the button for the ground floor. As the doors began to close, I saw Sarah stand up, her eyes fixed on me, her smile growing wider. Too wide. The doors shut, and I breathed a sigh of relief. I was just being paranoid. It was late, I was tired, and I needed sleep. But the next morning when I came in, Sarah was gone. Her desk was empty, the chair pushed in neatly. No one seemed to know where she'd gone, and the agency had no record of sending anyone named Sarah to our office. I tried to brush it off, but a week later, another temp arrived. A young man this time, quiet, with dark hair and pale blue eyes magnified by large glasses. He introduced himself with a polite, patient smile. "Hi, I'm Tom," he said. "I'll be helping out for a while." And in that moment, I felt the blood drain from my face. His eyes never blinked. His smile never wavered. And on his desk there was a plain brown folder, just like the one Sarah had been holding. As I stared at him, he turned his head ever so slightly, and I heard the faintest whisper, as if coming from far away. "She's still here, watching."
Story number 10.
Title: The Desk in the Corner. I had been working at Fletcher & Co. for only a month when I first noticed the desk in the corner. And it was an old wooden thing, scratched and dented, shoved against the far wall of the office, right next to the window that never quite closed. No one ever used it, and no one ever talked about it. It was like an unwritten rule. You just didn't go near the desk in the corner. The desk had a chair pushed under it, an old rolling chair with a ripped cushion. A faint smell of dust and something metallic hung around it. I asked Karen, my cubicle neighbor, about it one day. "Whose desk is that?" I asked, pointing. Karen's face went pale, and she glanced around nervously before leaning closer. "You don't want to know," she whispered. "Just stay away from it." "But why?" I pressed. She looked uncomfortable, like she was deciding whether to say more. Finally, she shook her head. "Just trust me, okay? No one sits there for a reason." I shrugged it off, figuring it was just office gossip or a joke that I wasn't in on yet. But the more I noticed the desk, the more it seemed to stand out. No one ever put their stuff on it. No one used the chair. And yet, there was always a faint impression, as if someone had been sitting there just moments before. The blinds behind the desk would sway slightly, even when the window was shut tight. A few weeks later, we had a new hire, Amanda, fresh out of college, full of energy and enthusiasm. She didn't know about the desk, and I didn't think to warn her. On her first day, she made a beeline for the corner desk, plopped her things down, and started setting up her laptop. Within minutes, people were whispering. Karen shot me a panicked look. "Someone needs to tell her," she hissed. I stood up, feeling a little foolish. "Hey, Amanda," I called out. "You might want to pick another desk. That one's not really used." Amanda laughed. "Why not? It's got a great view." She was right. The desk had the best view in the whole office, a wide window overlooking the park. Before I could say more, one of the senior managers, Tom, strode over. His face was tight, his eyes narrowed. "Amanda," he said in a low, serious tone, "I think you should sit somewhere else." Amanda looked confused. "But why? There's no one here." Tom hesitated, then glanced around the office. Everyone was watching now, silent, tense. "Just trust me," he muttered. "Please, pick another desk." Amanda rolled her eyes but complied, grabbing her things and moving to another spot. As soon as she did, I could feel the tension ease. People went back to work, and the strange moment passed. But Amanda was curious. Over lunch, she cornered me and demanded to know what the big deal was. "Why is everyone so freaked out about that desk?" she asked, biting into her sandwich. I hesitated, unsure of what to say. "I don't know, really," I admitted, "but I've heard rumors." "Rumors?" Amanda's eyes lit up with interest. "Like what?" I leaned closer, lowering my voice. "Apparently there was a guy who used to sit there. His name was James. He worked here years ago before I started. The story goes that he just disappeared one day. Never came back. No one knows what happened to him." Amanda frowned. "Disappeared? Like he quit?" I shook my head. "No, like he vanished. His stuff was still at his desk. His car was in the parking lot. But he was gone. They searched the building, the grounds, everything. No trace." Amanda snorted. "And you think the desk is haunted or something?" I laughed a little nervously. "I don't know about haunted, but people say weird things happen around that desk. Things move, lights flicker. Some people have even heard whispers." Amanda seemed amused. "Whispers? Seriously?" I nodded. "Yeah, seriously. I don't know if it's true, but, well, you saw how everyone reacted." She shook her head. still skeptical. "I don't believe in ghosts," she said, but I could see a flicker of doubt in her eyes. That evening, as I was finishing up, I noticed Amanda still at her desk typing away. I waved goodnight and she waved back, but her eyes kept drifting to the corner desk. I left, not thinking much of it. But the next morning, I came in to find the office buzzing. Amanda wasn't at her desk, her computer was still on, a half-finished cup of coffee sat next to her keyboard, and her coat was draped over her chair. But she was gone. I looked around, confused. "Where's Amanda?" I asked Karen, who was nervously biting her nails. Karen shook her head. "No one knows. She didn't go home last night. Her phone's here too." I felt a chill run down my spine. Did she sit at the desk?" Karen nodded slowly. "I think she stayed late and she might have moved over there." My heart pounded. "Did anyone check the desk?" Tom, the senior manager, overheard and came over, his face pale. "We checked," he said quietly. "Her things are still there, but she's not." I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. "Did anyone hear anything?" Tom looked around, making sure no one else was listening. Some of the night crew, they said they heard whispers, thought it was the wind, but... He trailed off, his eyes haunted. I decided to take a closer look. I walked over to the desk in the corner, the one everyone avoided. The air around it felt colder, despite the broken air conditioning. The chair was slightly pulled out, as if someone had just stood up. I hesitated, then reached out to touch it. The moment my fingers brushed the wood, I felt a shock, like static electricity. The lights above flickered, and I heard it. A faint whisper, so soft I almost thought I imagined it. "Help me." I jumped back, my heart racing. I looked around, but no one seemed to have heard it. "Did you hear that?" I asked Tom. He shook his head. "Hear what?" I stared at the desk, my mind racing. I wanted to tell myself it was just nerves, just the stress of Amanda's disappearance, but deep down I knew it wasn't that simple. I couldn't stop thinking about it. The whisper, the cold air, the stories. That night I stayed late, determined to find some answers. The office was quiet, just the faint hum of computers and the distant sound of traffic outside. I made my way to the desk in the corner. The chair was still slightly pulled out, the air around it still colder than the rest of the office. I took a deep breath and sat down. For a few moments, nothing happened. I felt foolish, sitting there in the dim light, waiting for something. Anything. But then the lights flickered again, and I heard it, clearer this time. "Please, help me." The voice was faint, almost desperate. I felt a shiver run down my spine. "Who are you?" I whispered. There was no answer, just a faint rustling, like papers moving in a breeze that I couldn't feel. I stood up, my heart pounding. I glanced at the window. It was shut tight. No wind, no draft. I turned to leave, but something stopped me. I felt a presence, a weight in the air. I turned back to the desk, and there, carved into the wood, were letters. Small, jagged letters that hadn't been there before. I stumbled back, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The lights flickered again, and I felt a cold hand brush against my shoulder. I spun around, but there was no one there. And then I heard it, right by my ear, so close I could feel the cold breath against my skin. She never left, neither did I. I ran, bolting for the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for air. The next day, I came in, and Amanda's desk was cleared out. Her things were gone, her computer shut off. No one said a word about it, but I saw the fear in their eyes. And the desk in the corner? Still empty, still cold.